I woke up not to my usual alarm, but to the crash of a trash bin falling onto the asphalt outside the window. At first, I didn't understand what had happened. The sleepy fog in my head slowly cleared, and without opening my eyes, I pulled the blanket over my head, trying to drift back into peace. But the noise continued, and I could feel irritation rising from within. Can't they do their job more quietly? My hand instinctively reached for my phone. I wanted to check the time, but instead a message flashed on the screen. "Hi." I didn't know the number, but I immediately knew it wasn't just a simple greeting. My heart clenched as I saw the attached photo. John, my husband, was sitting at a bar table. He was smiling, and next to him was a woman. She was laughing, her hand lightly touching his elbow. The look in her eyes, it was too personal, too intimate. I tried to gather my thoughts, searching for a rational explanation. "It's just a business dinner," I told myself, but her gaze wouldn't let go. I tried to close the phone screen, forcing myself to believe that it didn't matter, but something deep inside me had already changed. It wasn't just an image, it was the moment when everything became different. I picked up a glass of water from the nightstand and slowly drank it, feeling the cold taste on my tongue, but inside I was burning. I wanted to call him, but I couldn't. How could I say something I couldn't even understand myself? What was it? Betrayal? Unspoken words? I didn't know, but one thing I knew for sure, something in this world had shifted, and I could never go back to the world that existed before this morning. I felt the walls of my house pressing down on me. It was that moment when you realize you just need to leave, to step outside, to breathe, to apologize to the world for not having predicted that everything would change like this. I dressed without thinking about what I was putting on. A scarf, jeans, comfortable sneakers, just enough to keep moving. And I left. A walk through the park in downtown Charleston seemed like the only way to calm the raging thoughts. Sunlight pierced through the tree canopies, and everything around me was as it always had been, quiet, peaceful, as if nothing had changed. But I couldn't feel that peace. My thoughts kept returning to that photo. How had she looked at John? What did that look mean? The questions kept coming, but there were no answers. I sat on a bench near a cafe, trying to shake off these thoughts. Just then, I heard footsteps and saw him, Logan, my neighbor from the floor above. He was drinking coffee, slightly leaning forward, a book in his hands. Our eyes met for a split second, but I felt the air between us grow a little lighter. He seemed surprised to see me here. "Want some coffee?" he asked, nodding to the empty chair across from him. I hesitated for a moment. My mind raced with the thought that I shouldn't be talking to him, that I needed to be alone. But something in his voice, the way he spoke without any hint of anything extra, made me sit down. I didn't know what kind of moment this was, but I felt that I needed it right now. I agreed, and a few minutes later, I was holding a cup of coffee in my hands, burning myself, but not noticing the pain. Logan was laughing, telling me how disappointed he had been by the last movie he watched. His laugh was warm and sincere, and I felt a little lighter. I forgot about the looming shadow that was hanging over my life, forgot about John and the photo that still haunted me, and then, just when I thought I could take a break from all those tearing thoughts, Logan, out of nowhere, looked at me a little more intently. "Are you okay?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that made me fall silent. I nodded, but he didn't look away. "If you need to talk, I'm here," he added with a slight smile. It wasn't just a polite gesture. It was something real, almost a hidden care that I hadn't felt in a long time. The next evening, when John said he would be staying late at work, I didn't think twice and decided to go to a party at a colleague's place. It was an opportunity to break free from the four walls, to distract myself for at least an hour or two from everything I was feeling. The peace I had once known was gone. It had been replaced by anxiety. And I hoped that among people, laughter, and music, I could at least briefly forget about the photo, about John, about the fact that I couldn't call it my home. As I had expected, that evening I ran into Logan. He turned out to be a friend of one of the colleagues, and although I wasn't prepared for it, meeting him was oddly relieving. There was no judgment in his eyes, not even any curiosity. He was just there, like someone you could talk to, and I talked to him. He made another casual joke, and I involuntarily laughed. In that moment, he lightly touched my hand, just barely, almost by accident. But it was enough for me to feel how my heart responded to the gesture. For a brief second, it seemed as if the air thickened and all the noise around us vanished. There was nothing forceful, nothing sexual in his touch, but I felt something tighten in my chest, as though I had found myself at the center of a storm that wasn't going to let me go. We stood next to each other, and I could feel his breath, his presence. All my thoughts about John, about everything that had been happening, began to dissolve in that moment. I couldn't understand why, but it was exactly what I needed to feel. A moment that made me forget what I should have been doing, forget about the duty I owed to my husband, to myself. But I quickly returned to reality. "Sorry," I said, trying to pull myself away from the feeling, as if I had just done something wrong. But Logan didn't say anything. He just smiled and said, "Don't apologize." His words were so simple, but suddenly I understood that in that moment they meant something more than just friendly words. They were a permission to allow myself something else, something not quite right. That evening, I didn't return home the same. A few days later, when everything around me seemed empty and foggy, I heard a knock at the door, a spontaneous, sharp sound that broke me out of my tiring thoughts. I got up from the sofa, not expecting anyone, but when I opened the door, there stood Logan, holding a bouquet of daisies. "I happened to see them at the market and thought you might like them," he said, giving a slightly embarrassed smile. I didn't know how to react. Why had he come to see me? At that moment, I couldn't understand. Everything about this gesture was so simple, yet somehow incredibly personal. I tried to hide my confusion and invited him inside. In the kitchen, where everything looked the same as always, just a little fogged over by my undefined thoughts, we drank tea, and the conversation flowed on its own. Logan talked about his day, and I listened to him, not thinking about what would come next. It was easy to be with him, as if we had known each other for many years. There was none of the tension I often felt when talking to others. His words came out calmly, effortlessly, and every new story from him felt like a breath of fresh air. I noticed how he looked at me, but his gaze was quiet, asking nothing in return. He was simply looking, as if I were a part of the picture, a part of his life, even though we had only recently started talking. When the conversation ended and Logan stood up to leave, he looked at me again. And suddenly, I realized that something had happened between us that was more than just a conversation. His gaze was deep, filled with unspoken words. He leaned in as if in a moment of farewell and barely touched my lips. It was a light, almost imperceptible kiss. I didn't pull away, even though a million questions immediately sprang up in my mind. My mind screamed that this was wrong, that I shouldn't have allowed myself to feel that spark, but my body, as if agreeing with his gesture, remained still. When he left, I was alone. Everything inside me screamed that this was wrong, but at the same time I couldn't make myself regret what had happened. I didn't know why I didn't want to push him away, didn't understand why I didn't want to return to the world that existed before that kiss. But I knew one thing. This kiss had become a moment that I couldn't and didn't want to forget. I stood in silence, feeling how quickly the feeling I couldn't name began to grow stronger. Friday arrived. The morning began as usual. John got up, had breakfast, kissed me on the cheek, and left. He said he would be staying late at work, but I wasn't sure I believed him anymore. After what I had seen in the photo, everything had become murky, like water in an old bucket. We had stopped being the people who once talked to each other about little things, shared what had happened during the day. I tried not to think about it, but I couldn't. The thoughts pierced through me like needles. When John came home earlier than usual, I felt the tension in the air. He entered the hallway without taking off his shoes and froze in place. I noticed how his gaze immediately fell on the table where that same bouquet of daisies was sitting. Logan. I thought. Daisies. It was so inappropriate. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks, but I tried to remain calm. "Who's this from?" His voice was cold, direct, with no extra words. It was a question that seemed like it should have been asked a long time ago, but now it sounded especially sharp. I froze. Everything around me suddenly felt too loud. I felt a weight beginning in my chest. In that moment, I realized that I couldn't hide the truth any longer, but I didn't know how to say it. "It's a gift from a colleague," I said without thinking. A small lie, but it was necessary, for something bigger than just an excuse. John was silent. He looked at me, his gaze as cold as ice. He didn't believe me. I knew that. He knew I was lying. But he didn't say anything. Silence hung in the air. I felt it like a heavy curtain that couldn't be lifted. He didn't speak a word, but I could feel that we were on the edge of something, on the edge of understanding that things would never be the way they were before. We had lost our connection, lost our trust, and I didn't know how to bring it back. "I'm going to my sister's," John finally said, and his voice was empty, almost lifeless. "It's time to think about all of this. We have time." He didn't wait for a response, just walked into the bedroom and began packing his things. I couldn't move. I stayed in the kitchen, standing by the table with the strange bouquet of daisies, which now seemed like a symbol of what I had lost. He left, and I was left alone, with the emptiness inside, with the understanding that everything had changed. I could have said something, done something, but in that moment, it was too hard. I knew this was the moment when everything we had built came crashing down. When I was left alone in the empty apartment, the silence was louder than I had expected. Saturday turned out to be foggy and cold. I spent the whole day sitting on the couch trying to gather my thoughts into a coherent picture. John wasn't there, and I felt how the emptiness filled every space around me. There was no familiar sound of his footsteps, his voice, his presence. Instead, I found myself in a different world, a world where everything was wrong, where I couldn't go back anymore. Late in the morning, Logan called me. He suggested we drive out of town to the farmer's market. I couldn't really refuse. I needed to change something, even if just for a few hours. Leaving the apartment had become difficult, but Logan was the only person who didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. He was just there, and that was exactly what I'd been missing. We met at a cafe, and I felt how his presence gave me a certain comfort. He looked the same as always, calm, unhurried, with a gentle smile on his face. There was no judgment, no questions in his eyes, just warm sincerity. We drove toward the farmer's market, and for the first time in a long while, I felt how the reality around me began to become clearer. The wind, the fresh air, the smells of fresh vegetables and flowers, everything felt real, alive. As we walked through the market, talking about simple things, I felt as though something in my world was returning to its rightful place. We strolled among the herb stalls, sampled local products, and laughed. Logan held my hand, and the touch felt so natural, as if we had been doing it every day. His hand was warm, and when I felt it, it became easier. Everything I had tried to suppress inside me became clear. With him, I felt alive, free. I didn't think about going back home, didn't think about John, or the fact that I had left him in the apartment, filled with emptiness and silence. Here, at this market, with this person, I felt as though I were born again. We walked through the entire market, stopped at a small stall with local cheeses, and suddenly Logan suggested buying something special for dinner. "What do you like?" he asked, and his voice was so casual that I almost instinctively answered, "Parmesan." We picked out a few pieces of cheese, and then, stopping on the street, I suddenly realized that this moment had become important to me. It was the moment when I felt that my life could be different. I could be free. I could allow myself something I had long forgotten. It wasn't a delusion. It was real life. Logan looked at me, and I saw in his gaze something that could have been something more than just a walk. And I didn't try to deny it. I could choose not to think about it, tell myself that it was temporary, but I felt something inside me changing. And when we got back into his car, I sat in the front seat and looked at him. At that moment, I couldn't say what exactly was happening, but I knew one thing. With him, I felt alive. In the evening, when I returned home, I felt how the air in the apartment had become heavy, as if all the weight of my hidden emotions, all the unspoken feelings, had finally crashed down on me. John still hadn't returned. He hadn't written or called, and it felt as though I couldn't breathe in this empty space, hour after hour, but the thoughts I couldn't forget still wouldn't leave my mind. I tried to force calmness into myself, but my heart kept pounding faster, not allowing me to disconnect from this internal chaos. I felt something breaking, and then I heard his footsteps. John entered the apartment, and immediately everything around seemed to tighten. He was changed, his face was tense, his movements rigid. He stopped by the door, still wearing his jacket. "What's going on?" he asked, and in his voice I heard despair, but also cold determination. He already knew. He knew that everything was not the way it was before. I stood in the hallway, unable to move. There was no point in hiding it. He had found our conversation with Logan on my phone. He had seen how we texted, how we laughed together, and it was too much for him, too painful. "You know something's wrong between us," I said, trying not to hide the truth. I couldn't lie anymore. I couldn't keep up this farce. My heart was no longer tied to him. "John, I can't keep living like this. I feel like we've lost each other, both you and I. We're no longer us." His eyes narrowed, he clenched his jaw. His gaze became stone cold, but I didn't care. I wasn't afraid. I could feel how this wall of silence we had built between us over the years had finally broken down. "Do you really want this?" His voice was low and heavy, but I could no longer back down. I looked at him, not trying to justify myself. I understood that I could never return to the past. "I can't hide this anymore," I said softly. My words were almost a whisper, but they were full of truth. He didn't say anything. He turned and walked toward the door. I stood still, unable to move. He didn't shout, didn't argue. He just left, as if knowing that everything between us had already been said. His footsteps faded in the hallway, and silence once again filled the space. I was alone. In the room that had once been our home, where laughter and conversation had been so simple, but now everything was empty. And yet, I didn't feel regret. I knew I had made the right choice for myself. A few minutes later, I heard the door slam, and I realized that John had left. In that moment, despite all the pain, I felt something freeing. We were no longer bound by what had kept us together before. It was the end. And although it was a painful end, I knew that a new moment would come, a moment when I could choose my own path. I was left alone in the empty apartment. Everything around me felt foreign. The walls, the furniture, even the sounds that I once considered familiar no longer brought comfort. It was a strange moment when you realize that everything that was once your reality no longer matters. I remained in this chaos of thoughts, trying to find meaning, but it kept slipping away from me. Yet despite all of this, I felt that something important had happened. I had freed myself from the chains I had put on myself. The next morning I woke up, and before getting out of bed, I immediately looked at my phone. Somehow, on its own, I sent Logan a short message. "Are you free today?" The reply came almost instantly. "Yes, how can I help?" A couple of hours later, I was standing at his door. Logan invited me in, and with his presence in my life, everything suddenly became clear. I couldn't call it love. I couldn't fully understand what was happening, but I felt that it was something more than just simple comfort. It was a step into the unknown. "Want to go to the coast?" he suggested, and I felt how his words swept me away. "Let's spend the day there. You need a distraction." I nodded without hesitation. We left. The drive lasted several hours, but all those hours were filled with a silence in which I felt peace. It was that moment when you simply need to exist, and you realize that the world can be different if you allow yourself to be a part of it. When we arrived, Logan took my hand, and I couldn't pull away. We walked along the beach, and I felt the sand crunching beneath my nails, the salty air filling my lungs. We were silent, but it wasn't the kind of silence that tears your soul apart. It was the silence of understanding. We sat on the sand, and I felt his arm slip around my shoulders. There was nothing hurried, nothing intrusive in this gesture. It felt so natural, so calm. I looked at the sea, watching the endless waves roll, while he sat next to me without a word. But in his presence, I felt everything I needed to understand. When he leaned in to kiss me, I suddenly realized that I was on the threshold of a new life. It was a life full of emotions, uncertainty, and freedom. At that moment, I couldn't think about the future. I couldn't think about the consequences. I was here, and now. Everything I had gone through until this moment felt distant and insignificant. I was ready to face what was coming, and perhaps this was the beginning of something new, something that would give me the chance to be myself.